My name is Will Steffen. I'm an Earth System Scientist based in Canberra, Australia, and I'm an emeritus professor, retired professor with the Australian National University. But I've spent much of my career working internationally. So back from 1998 to 2004, I was director of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program. Rather a long name, but it brought together scientists from around the world, from over 50 countries, to study the planetary system. How does the Earth system work? How do the biosphere and the climate and humans interact, and so on. I've also kept, after that, a connection, particularly with Europe. I've worked quite closely with colleagues in Stockholm, Sweden, at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and also at the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research, which of course is based in Germany. But I've kept up interaction with a lot of other colleagues from around the world. So I would basically describe myself as an international scientist based in Australia, but trying to study how our planet operates and how humans are changing it. Planetary boundaries were developed by a group of about 25 of us in 2007, 2008, led by a scientist named Johan Rockström from Stockholm, but who's now director of PIC in Potsdam. The idea is to look at our planet as a single system and to look at the minimum number of boundaries or guardrails, you might say, that we need to observe to keep the planet in a stable state. So we're trying to understand how the Earth operates as a system. We look at the stability of the last nearly 12,000 years, which has allowed us humans to develop agriculture, villages, cities, and so on, and to say, how resilient, how robust is that system, and what are the guardrails we need to observe to stay within that system? So initially, we've defined 9 such guardrails, or planetary boundaries, as we call them, and we've tested this system quite often. We published a big update in 2015, and we've still kept those 9 boundaries. So we tried to distill the system down to the minimum number of guardrails. You could think of hundreds of them, and there's scientific papers written about all of these. But we want something that's tractable, that people can understand, that governments can understand, and that people can perhaps even start to take some action in terms of respecting these guardrails and getting our planet back into a stable state. One is climate change, which is in the news all the time. The second one is called biosphere integrity, and the biosphere is the living part of Earth, and integrity means you keep it in a stable, well-functioning state, a lot of biodiversity, and so on. So those are 2 big ones. There's a third one, which also is potentially a very big one, and that's what we call novel entities. Novel entities are the new stuff that we humans are making, and we're shoving into the Earth system. It's never seen it before. Plastics are a good example. Many chemicals are a good example. Radioactive materials are another example. And you could also think a little bit more broadly, things like artificial intelligence, the digital technologies. These are all new things that are new to the Earth system. So those are 3 big core boundaries. Each one of those on its own could drive the Earth system into another state. In other words, just climate on its own, as we're doing now, we've left the Holocene, the last 11,700 years stable state, and we're in the Anthropocene, which is a rapidly changing trajectory. Also, mass extinction events, and the Earth has seen 5 of those in the past. They move the entire Earth system into a different state, like when the dinosaurs went extinct. So that's why that's a core boundary. So those 2 are well established. The third one we're debating, and that's novel entities, because if you have, say, a massive nuclear war, you would create nuclear winter, radioactivity would kill a lot of animals in the biosphere. That would be a new planet as well. So we think that we can also call that one a core boundary. The 2 core boundaries we're really concerned about, and that's climate change. I probably don't need to talk too much about that because that's in the news all the time. Here in Australia, we're acutely aware with the massive bushfires we had just before the coronavirus crisis broke out. But also in the background down here, we've had the 3rd mass bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef in only the last 5 years. That's unheard of. This one extended 2,000 kilometers north to south along the entire length of the Great Barrier Reef. So we're very concerned about biosphere integrity, and we're very concerned, obviously, about climate change. So the biosphere integrity one, interestingly, may have something to do with the coronavirus pandemic, because the more we degrade the biosphere and the more humans are interacting with the degraded biosphere, the higher probability there is that what's called zoonotic diseases will jump into the human system. So those two are really important, and we see evidence today that we suffer from the destabilization of these boundaries. A group of us who sort of look after this whole concept are now working on the third major update of the planetary boundaries framework. And some of the big things we're looking at now are, can we understand biosphere integrity better? In other words, can we come up with a good indicator, like carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere for climate? So we don't have an answer to that yet, but we're working on it. Novel entities I talked about, but we want to bring that more prominently into the framework. It's sort of been sitting in the background, only treated as chemical pollution so far. But I think the most important thing we're doing with this update now is to look at the interactions among the planetary boundaries. So far, we've sort of looked at these nine as nine individual things, each with their own guardrail or target, each with their own bit of science behind them. But we know that it's one Earth system and that a lot of these interact. In fact, we're seeing interaction today with the COVID virus, which may have to do with biosphere integrity. And that's affecting the climate change boundary because emissions are going down quite strongly around the world as economies go into hibernation, so to speak, as we try to deal with the COVID virus. But you can look at all sorts of other boundary interactions. For example, if you look at phosphorus and nitrogen, and we're putting those nutrients far too much, we're putting far too many of them in the biosphere. And what that's doing, it's destabilizing the biosphere itself. It's polluting the water. It's affecting coastal zones. It's affecting rivers and so on. If you look at deforestation in the Amazon, land system change, that's actually affecting the climate too, because it's changing the evaporation of water from the forest. And that forest is so huge, it actually affects the global climate system. So we know that these interactions exist, and we can start to describe them, but we haven't really formally put them into our framework very well. Now, you can't really do that just by talking about them. So this next update of the framework will involve some modeling, where we take some of the most recent Earth system models and we test our planetary boundaries framework. And in particular, we look at the interactions and ask ourselves, how important are they? How much do the interactions change where we should place these guardrails? This brought home to Australians who normally don't think about science and certainly don't think about planetary boundaries. I think it gave a good example of what happens when you cross a threshold or you trigger a tipping point. And I think that's what happened with these massive fires. So let me just describe a little bit what actually happened. So, of course, our forests are mainly dominated by eucalyptus trees, and they burn naturally anyway. They're fire-prone trees. But if you look at what we call the temperate forests along the east coast of Australia, that's where most of the forests are. On average, about 2% of them burn every year. And it's just a patchwork. You know, it takes about 20 or 30 years, and then it comes back and burns again. And in a really bad year, you might get 4 or 5% burned. This year, we burned 21%. And that was massive. It had never happened before. And in fact, as far as we can see, it's never happened in any other forest around planet Earth, that much burning. The intensity was amazing. The firefighters could not fight them. Some of the flames were 60, 70 meters high, incredibly intense. They were moving through the crowns, the tops of the trees, at enormous speeds. They killed over 1 billion animals. A lot of Australians, and particularly the firefighters, are suffering mental problems after this because they had seen, for example, kangaroos that were actually on fire hopping out of the forest and then burning to death in front of them. And they heard animals, birds, koalas screaming as they got burnt to death. So it was a horrible, horrible experience. Not to mention, of course, that humans lost their lives, villages were destroyed, and so on. So it was a huge psychological shock. There were so many traumatic experiences that Australians underwent during the bushfires that it was a completely new experience. So then, of course, the analysis came in, and of course, what we've seen is that climate change was the major reason. And behind that were a couple of things. One is 2019, the year leading up to the fires, was by far the hottest year we have ever had since records began in terms of extreme temperatures. So this was extreme heat week after week after week. But the 2 years leading up, 2018 and 2019, were the driest on record in Southeast Australia. So you had forests which were subjected to exceptionally dry conditions and very hot conditions, both of which the major driver was climate change. So that message is getting through now, and suddenly we see in Australia a much bigger interest in climate change, much more pressure on getting climate change under control and so on. So hopefully this represents perhaps what you might call a tipping point, a social tipping point, in terms of Australian citizens understanding that climate change is not something for the future. It's not just some scientific problem. It's things that kills people, destroys forests, kills animals, and it's here now. There are experts in the field who have already published peer-reviewed papers saying that the fact that we're degrading the biosphere, we're interacting more with the degraded biosphere, increases the probability that we'll get diseases like this. They'll jump into humans, and then because we don't have resistance, we're not adapted to them, it'll spread through human populations as it is today. So there's a concern that as we continue to degrade the biosphere, the risk of these sort of outbreaks like the coronavirus, the risk will increase. We don't know when or how they will actually start, but it's just that we'll be subject to an increasing risk that we'll have to face these sort of pandemics. I think we're learning very quickly as scientists and as people in general to communicate with each other via digital means like we are today. Via Zoom, had all sorts of Zoom meetings. And I think that's good in a way because we've cut our travel way down. But on the other hand, one of the downsides is we miss the social interaction in person, because we humans are very social creatures, and so are scientists, although some people don't think we are. But one of the big advantages of being able to meet in person is that we can talk together, we can interact better, and after we have our meetings, we can go out and have a drink and socialize, and that's actually an important part of getting to know other people and work with other people. So although there are some upsides in terms of reducing air travel and emissions with the coronavirus and its effects on travels and meetings, I think it's still very important for us humans to get together. And in that regard, I am looking forward to coming to Groningen eventually when we get this under control and meeting new colleagues there.